Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into the deeply complex international laws of war, and we're going to use the recent Israel-Gaza conflict as our case study. Specifically, we're focusing entirely on a concept that is literally at the very center of today's global debate: how war proportionality laws actually work when applied to modern combat. So, how exactly does the world decide if a bombing crosses the line into a war crime? It's a heavy question. When we see devastating images on the news, our human instinct immediately searches for justice, right? But here's the thing: international law doesn't judge based on raw emotion or instinct. It actually relies on a highly specific, objective legal framework. And amidst all the incredibly polarized rhetoric out there, understanding that framework is absolutely crucial. To keep this explainer completely neutral, we're going to break things down into four clear areas: the foundation, the military argument, the civilian reality, and finally, the impossible calculus. Let's get right into it. Starting off with Section 1, the foundation. Basically, before we can evaluate any specific strike, we have to understand the actual rulebook modern armies are supposed to follow. What is proportionality? Now, you might be wondering what that actually means in practice. A lot of people think proportionality means a simple one-to-one death ratio, like you just match body counts. But legally, that's not it at all. It's actually a legal calculus of whether the collateral damage outweighs the military advantage. If striking a highly valuable military target is going to result in civilian casualties, the law asks one core question: was the anticipated civilian harm excessive compared to the military gain? As you can probably guess, this creates a massive tension between legal ideals and military reality. In an ideal textbook scenario, proportionality means using GPS-guided precision munitions to take out, say, a single floor of a building. But critics argue there's a competing strategy happening here, something called the Dahia Doctrine. This is a concept allegedly developed back in the 2006 Lebanon War, and it involves deliberately inflicting disproportionate damage on civilian infrastructure to establish deterrence and make the enemy pay a heavy price. That brings us to Section 2, the military argument. How exactly does a military justify widespread destruction within this strict legal framework? Well, the military argument is heavily grounded in the October 7th Hamas attacks, where 1,200 Israelis were killed. As outlined by former Israeli spokesperson Ilan Levy, this frames the subsequent war not as just a standard territorial dispute, but as a necessary response to a completely existential threat. From their perspective, the goal is dismantling a terrorist army sworn to repeat those attacks. To justify the massive scale of the strikes, the military argues they are fighting a totally unique urban war where Hamas deliberately rigs civilian infrastructure. Think about this. Hamas operates within tunnels that are significantly longer than the entire New York City's subway system. Because of that, the IDF argues they are forced to clear these areas, and they emphasize that they use unprecedented precautions, like making advance phone calls and using roof knocks to urge civilians to evacuate before the strikes even happen. So the takeaway from military officials is essentially this: the responsibility for civilian deaths actually lies with those hiding behind them. For the military, true proportionality is nearly impossible in an environment where the enemy intentionally booby-traps residential areas and essentially sacrifices their own population to win a public relations war. Now, let's pivot to Section 3, the civilian reality. Let's look at the antithesis of the military argument by examining the staggering toll on the ground. 42 million. That is the estimated number of tons of rubble currently sitting in Gaza. Journalists like Mehdi Hassan point to this statistic because it fundamentally challenges the narrative of a purely precise, targeted military operation. Critics look at these horrific statistics and argue that dropping highly destructive 2,000-pound bombs on crowded refugee camps completely violates the very principle of proportionality we talked about. On top of that, human rights groups highlight instances of deadly airstrikes hitting areas the military had specifically designated as safe zones, along with deeply disturbing incidents, like the case of 6-year-old Hind Rajab, whose car was struck by 3,350 bullets. Let's look at a specific case study from 2021 that tracks the destruction of 4 major commercial towers housing international media. Now, the IDF claimed these buildings housed Hamas intelligence, and while they did provide warnings to evacuate, allowing people to escape, they used overwhelming force to completely pancake the entire buildings, rather than just targeting specific individual floors. For human rights and media organizations, incidents exactly like this one are incredibly frustrating. They argue it's just inconceivable to completely flatten a massive civilian and commercial tower, one that's vital to the daily life of the city, without publicly presenting the evidence that actually justified it. If you can't prove the military advantage to the public, they argue, the destruction appears inherently disproportionate. And legal experts bring up a really fascinating point here. They argue that even if we totally accept the military's premise that Hamas has taken the entire civilian population hostage, the attacking military must still treat those civilians with the exact same caution they would use if their own citizens were the hostages. Simply put, you wouldn't drop a 2,000-pound bomb on a house if your own people were held captive inside. Which brings us to our final section, the impossible calculus. Why is synthesizing these two totally opposing realities into legal accountability so incredibly difficult? Well, because the law relies heavily on intent rather than just numbers, debates constantly rage over whether the destruction is a tragic byproduct of urban combat or a deliberate genocidal campaign. As historian Benny Morris points out, the definition of genocide isn't just about a high body count. It demands absolute proof of the intent to destroy a people. You can clearly see this stark contrast in our sources. One side claims strict adherence to legal precaution in a battlefield that is impossibly rigged, while the other side points to the unprecedented child death toll and completely destroyed infrastructure as undeniable proof of a criminal campaign. And to make things even more complicated, there is fierce disagreement over the absolute core facts on the ground. Some human rights investigators completely reject the military's foundational premise that Hamas intentionally places military targets inside their own family homes. They argue it just defies basic human logic to knowingly endanger your own children. If you take away just one thing from this explainer, let it be this. International law right now is basically trapped in the friction between classified military intelligence that we cannot see and the undeniable physical devastation that we can see. Proportionality laws might look perfect on paper, but in the dense fog of modern urban war, calculating the balance between an unseen military threat and a very visible civilian tragedy is an almost impossible task for outside observers. It leaves us with this final provocative thought. When both sides rely on fundamentally opposed narratives, one citing an existential war of survival against an enemy using human shields, the other citing an unprecedented, unjustifiable slaughter of innocents, how does the international community actually enforce the law when the evidence required to prove proportionality is buried under 42 million tons of rubble? Will we ever find a truth the whole world can agree on?